Greetings, students, and welcome to Chapter 16, Evolution. In this unit, we'll be talking about what evolution is, the historical contribution of different sciences that led to our understanding of evolution, as well as the mechanisms that power evolution and evidence that supports the argument that Darwin put forth of the mechanism of natural selection as the factor that shapes evolution. So let's get started. First of all, before we start, we need to define the term evolution. And evolution, very simply, is change over time in a population. Now, what are we talking about when we're talking about change over time in a population? What we're talking about is, in evolution, the creation of shifts in population as environmental factors change. And population shifts occur over a long period of time. And what happens is, as the environment changes, some organisms with particular types of traits will be favored over other organisms, and those particular traits will become more prevalent over time. Therefore, the population will change over time. So whereas it might appear as, like, for example, an organism is literally changing to another organism, as you see in this particular unit, you'll see the variations already existed within the population itself, and those variations may become favored depending on how the environment changes. So that's what we're going to be looking at in this particular unit. We're going to talk about the facts that support evolution, and we'll also talk about the theory of evolution itself in terms of Darwin's theory of natural selection. And remember, natural selection is a theory, so it's an ongoing organic concept that continually changes over time as scientists get a better understanding, acquire more knowledge, more facts and data to support the idea. So some of the pieces of evidence that we'll talk about in this unit were not necessarily pieces of information or support that Darwin had available to him at his time when he was put forth his idea of natural selection. Now, we're going to be talking a lot about Charles Darwin, so we need to talk a little bit about his voyage on the Beagle. Charles Darwin was a naturalist, which meant he was really a scientist that was an expert in all kinds of aspects of nature, from fauna to flora. He was an expert in plants, animals, all that kind of stuff. So when he was a young man, he traveled pretty much around the globe on the HMS Beagle as the naturalist on the ship. And he did a lot of scientific work studying life, basically wherever they landed. And he recorded all that data, took specimens, fossil samples, that kind of stuff. And this journey really helped shape the direction of the rest of his life and helped to help create this idea of the mechanism of natural selection as the power behind evolution or change in organisms. Now, what did Darwin observe on his travels? He observed plants, animals, and one of the things that he was really impressed about was he noticed how some organisms were better able to survive and they produced offspring, and the species perpetuated. But he was also puzzled by things like where species live, why some species lived here, some species didn't live there, and that kind of stuff. So all this stuff helped generate a lot of different ideas for him for when he came back to England later and worked on his books. During his travels, Darwin made numerous observations, collected tons of evidence to help create his idea of natural selection. Now, one of the things we have to remember is Darwin did not come up with the theory of evolution, as you'll see in a few slides. The concept of evolution was already around. He's attributed to evolution a lot of times erroneously. He came up with the theory of natural selection, which is the mechanism, I'm going to write that here, the mechanism that powers evolution. So this is the factor that changes, that causes the change in populations of species over time. Some of the other things that Darwin also observed were fossil remains. These fossils, of course, preserved remains of once living organisms, helped shape a lot of his views of things as well, because he could see in the fossil some remained species that they recognized or resembled species that were once alive, and that are alive still at his time and present. And he also found structures that were different and creatures that he didn't see. So it helped put together this picture of something that we'll be talking about later called common descent, where particular populations seem to have derived from like one particular main line of species and changed depending on where their populations were located and the environments that they lived in. Most of the work that Darwin has recognized for is his work on the Galapagos Islands here. And that's an archipelago of islands off the coast of South America, but it was a fantastic place to do his research because these islands were all so isolated from each other. So there was a great distance. So each one of these islands had different types of habitats, but yet they were close enough that organisms could actually get there. Maybe they float on something, fly on something, not fly, for example, like the finches. And so where they landed, they would land in a different environment or different ecosystem, and that would help shape how the population would change over time. So we would find finches on one island that looked different than finches on another island, but then similar at the same time. And tortoises were another great example, how each one of them seemed to have become adapted to fit perfectly into the environment that they lived in. So this got Darwin thinking, some of these birds, for example, the finches or the tortoises, look quite similar to each other, but then they were different. And they seemed to have, each one of them like a little niche that they had found in their environment, and some special things, what we call adaptations, which we'll be learning about a little bit later, adaptations that helped them to survive in their environment. So he wondered if maybe perhaps they were all related once upon a time. Did they come from one particular land first, and like I said, fly there or drift there or whatever, get carried there, and then the population changed over time to fit into the environment that it lived in. So a lot of what he observed in the Galapagos had a huge impact on his thought process when he returned to England and helped shape the writing of his landmark book, The Origin of the Species. And moving into section 2 here, we're going to start looking at the major scientists that had an impact on Darwin's thinking. So it wasn't just his journeys, which had a huge impact on what he was thinking. It was also a lot of different scientists had a great impact on what Darwin was conjuring over the years. All right, so let's start looking at some of the scientists. We'll start with Hutt and Lyell. Hutt and Lyell were geologists, and their contribution to Darwin's thought process really wasn't so much about evolution itself, but it was about the Earth and how the Earth was much older than scientists had originally believed. At this particular time, scientists believed the Earth was a few thousand years old, but Hutt and Lyell challenged that, like perhaps the Earth was millions of years old. And if that was the case, that meant that evolution could be plausible because there was enough time in the history of the world for populations to shift. And they also recognized that there were changes on the Earth, factors, shifting plates, volcanoes, earthquakes, all the things on the Earth that caused the Earth's surface to change have been around basically since the beginning of time. And they called that the law of uniformitarianism. And that these processes that are changing the Earth today were in there in the past, and they'll be here in the future, continually changing the Earth's surface, adding pressure to organisms. It's kind of, I guess, what Darwin would have thought of it as, because if the environment is changing, organisms are going to have to respond to it. And the way they respond will affect how the population shifts over time, who has what types of adaptations that will give them the advantage or make them more fit, as you'll see in a few minutes, depending on the environment they're living in and how it changed. And so Lyell's principles of geology is where he really emphasized this idea of uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism. The fact that the Earth is continually changing, will continue to change, and the processes that are changing Earth and shaped it will continue into the future. Again, that's called uniformitarianism. Now, how did this impact Darwin, as we mentioned? It means Earth was much older, so evolution did have enough time. And, of course, we know the process of a population shifting would take time. And that's what Hutton and Lyell contributed, this fact that the Earth was old enough and was continually changing, and then this would, of course, have an effect on life. That's kind of how Darwin viewed it. Another scientist that had a huge impact on this concept of evolution by natural selection, in terms of what Darwin was talking about, was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He was another scientist that was recognizing at that particular time that evolution was taking place. But Lamarck, his mechanism for evolution was different than Darwin's. So remember, Darwin did not come up with the idea of evolution. That was already being discussed by scientists. He came up with the mechanism. Now, Lamarck had his own mechanism for evolution. It seems kind of silly now, but we'll talk about that because he's one of the scientists who helped get the conversation going. And Lamarck recognized that organisms change over time and that they adapt to their environment. But his mechanism was interesting. He called this concept of acquired traits. And basically what Lamarck felt was that if organisms used the particular structures that gave them an advantage, over time those structures would become better. Or if they didn't use them, they would lose them over time. And if they kind of willed these traits to be better, these traits could then be passed on over to their offspring. It was like organisms were kind of pushing themselves towards perfection via use and disuse, which kind of seems silly nowadays, but seemed plausible to him at the time. So what are we talking about? We're talking like about, imagine the canopy in some area has very high foliage. And so the giraffes have a hard time reaching that foliage to feed. So imagine this giraffe neck is rather short, so it's going to struggle to eat. So Lamarck's view would be that over time this giraffe would stretch his neck and continue to stretch his neck and continue to will himself or herself to stretch the neck longer. And eventually over time the neck would actually become longer. See, as they work towards perfection, they acquire these traits that would enable them to be more successful in their environment. And then the neck would be changed and then passed on to the offspring. There's another example here with the fiddler crab actually being able to will its claw to become bigger so that it can ward off predators. Seems kind of silly now, doesn't it? We now know that, of course, that organisms can't will themselves to change during their lifespan. What changes, as you'll see through evolution, and what Darwin was talking about, was the population shifting. The traits, like for example having the longer neck or the larger claw, already existed within the population, maybe in a small number, but it was there, maybe not noticeable. But as the population shifts over time as a result of changes in the environment, those particular traits that maybe were in a small representation in the population may become more prevalent if they give the organism the advantage and they're better suited for their environment. They'll be able to reproduce in larger quantities and pass that trait on. So the population will shift over time, but remembering the variations were already there through mechanisms such as sexual reproduction, genetic mutation, those kind of things. The variations already existed. That's different than what Lamarck said. Lamarck said that these organisms could actually power the variation themselves. That's not true. The variations already existed. They only become more or less prevalent depending on what happens in the environment. And so you can, of course, see here again, Lamarck would have said that this claw got much larger because the fiddler crab needed it and willed it over time. That's not how evolution would be viewed according to Darwin and his idea of natural selection, which we'll be talking about in section 3. He would have said that these claws were already in existence in somewhere in the population, and if they gave them the advantage of being able to scare away these other crabs and be able to protect their territory and find mates, that they would be able to pass that on, and then the population would shift that way. Not that they could will their claw to become bigger. So in summary, Lamarck's idea of evolution was not correct, and it's kind of put kind of in the trash heap of history. But he's important because he paved the way for other biologists and really initiated the conversation of evolution. So remember, Darwin did not initiate or begin the conversation of evolution. He did not come up with the idea of evolution. He came up with the most recognized mechanism of powering evolution, which is natural selection, and that's the basis of section 3 of the chapter. Another person that had an impact on Darwin's work was Thomas Malthus, and he kind of viewed the world as headed towards this incredible competition point where there were growing amounts of population but limited amounts of resources, and then eventually would come a point where the populations would outstrip the amount of available resources. So in concluding his work, Malthus kind of reasoned that if the human population continued to grow unchecked, there just wouldn't eventually be enough living space, food, water, that kind of stuff, and which would then, of course, result in this incredible competition for those scarce resources. And Darwin was impacted by that. He recognized that this is the same thing that happens in nature, that organisms are also competing for limited space, territory, food, mates, that kind of stuff. And the ability to be able to successfully compete would determine what type of traits would be passed on from parent to offspring. This idea of competition and fitness, these kind of things. these are going to be the elements of what we talk about in section 3. So I'd like to stop for today right here, and then we'll continue up in this part 2, which we'll talk about natural selection, what it is, fitness, adaptations, all that kind of stuff, and section 4, the evidence that supports the idea of evolution through natural selection.
Although he's usually credited with developing the theory of evolution, it's more accurate to say that Charles Darwin introduced the theory of natural selection, the mechanism for evolution, in 1859. More than 20 years before, Darwin had set sail aboard the HMS Beagle to study the flora and fauna of South America, despite the fact that he was perpetually seasick.
Oh my.
Well into the 5-year study, Darwin reached the Galapagos Islands.
The natural history of this archipelago is very remarkable. It seems to be a little world within itself. The greater number of its inhabitants, both vegetable and animal, being found nowhere else.
Among the animals Darwin found were lots of birds, finches to be precise. He collected 13 varieties, all very much alike except for the size and shape of their beaks.
I came to the conclusion that all the finches were descended from one species.
Over a long period of time, the birds' beaks had changed. Each was adapted to the kind of food available in their local area. Seed eaters' beaks were different from insect eaters' beaks, and so on. From this and other observations, Darwin developed the theory of natural selection. Certain conditions must be met for natural selection to occur.
There must be a population of things that can make copies of themselves. The copying process must be imperfect, and the copying errors must lead to differences in the ability of the offspring to survive and make copies of themselves.
These copying errors may result in the offspring being better suited to their environment. Or perhaps not. But if the changed offspring are better able to survive, then that change will likely endure and spread throughout the population over generations. For example, there is a species of moth, Biston betullaria, but hardly anyone calls them that ranges in color from light to dark. A population of them lived in a birch forest. Light-colored moths blended with the tree bark, but darker ones stood out against the white birch bark. Birds ate more dark moths because they were easier to spot, leaving mostly light-colored moths to reproduce. Then came the Industrial Revolution, and with it, air pollution. The white birch bark turned sooty gray. Now the pale moths were more visible to birds, and the darker ones were camouflaged.
Oh no!
Birds began eating more pale-colored moths. In less than 100 years, the population of moths shifted from mostly pale to mostly dark.
In this example, it pays to be different. When natural selection favors a single trait, such as color, it's called directional selection.
Remember the Galapagos finches? During droughts, birds with strong, large, or very long bills were better equipped to survive. Those with average, medium bills were out of luck.
This is an example of disruptive selection. It pays to be a survivor with the right equipment.
But sometimes it pays to be average. The third distinct type of natural selection is called stabilizing selection, and it favors individuals that are the most like everyone else.
Over time, the most common traits are favored, and the extreme ones are reduced or even eliminated.
Today, the scientific evidence for evolution and natural selection underscores the complexity and beauty of biological design.